Hello, folks. Welcome to the Genuinely Interested podcast. I'm your host, Roy Bensby. This podcast is an opportunity for me to speak with some of the most interesting people I know, either with amazing talents or achievements or unbelievable life stories or just invaluable insights into areas which they have dedicated their lives to studying. I sit down with these amazing individuals from across the planet and I try to ask them questions that will hopefully help you, the listener, extract something valuable or learn something new or just hopefully get inspired by. You can find all the episodes for the podcast on all the major podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Spotify, Google, Overcast, iHeartRadio, literally all of them. It's there. If you love the show, if it adds value to your life in any way, shape, or form, please leave reviews on iTunes. It really helps grow the podcast. It puts it up there so more people can see it. You can also find all the episodes and everything else, all the information that's updated regularly on the website, which is roybensv.com, roybentzvi.com, and you can sign up for updates as well. Also been updating the YouTube channel, so I've been uploading old episodes pretty much on a daily basis, so you can find it there. And in the future, I hope to make video podcasting as well. If that's something you guys want to check out and are interested in, please shoot me email. I'd love to hear from you. And also make sure to check out the social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter. I post there daily. And lastly, if you guys want to support and help grow the podcast, please go to Buy Me a Coffee or Anchor or Patreon. It is an endeavor to grow this podcast and make it what it should be. And it takes a village. So I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. I see that there are literally listeners from all over the world in each and every country. So thank you to everyone and on to the show. Hello, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for tuning in on yet another week and another show and another great guest. So this week I have Peter Singer. He does not need a lot of introductions. Peter Singer is often referred to as one of the most influential living philosophers. He's written such amazing books as Animal Liberation, The Most Good You Can Do, The Ethics of What We Eat. The new book that's going to be released April 20th, I believe, is The Golden Ass. It is a book that he edited. It's a very, very old book, and I already ordered it. Can't wait to get it. I should be actually receiving it around the time that this episode is released, so I can't wait. Peter is a big influence in a lot of people's choice to, I believe, go vegan. He has, Animal Liberation as a classic. I'm sure he's changed hearts and minds all over the world and probably helped hundreds of millions, if not billions of animals not get slaughtered in the process. So really, living legend. I'm glad I got an hour to speak with him and ask him some really important questions. And I hope you guys enjoy this episode. So without further ado, here is Peter Singer. Enjoy the episode, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Peter Singer, how you doing?
Doing very well, thank you.
Thanks for being on the podcast. It's almost surreal. I've been following your work for so long. And to have you on the podcast talking to you, it's an honor. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
So Peter Singer, philosopher, educator, author, and the godfather of the animal liberation movement. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, the original inspiration? What made you write Animal Liberation in the first place? I mean, you were kind of one of the first pioneers in this movement. What did you see at the time that maybe no one else was really seeing or really was paying attention to?
Well, I can't really say that nobody else was seeing it. I may have been a pioneer in the sense of writing the book, but I was introduced to the idea by some others who I met at Oxford. This was in 1970 when I was a graduate student at Oxford. And quite by chance, I happened to have lunch with another graduate student, and I when we sat down for lunch, he asked whether there was meat in the spaghetti sauce, and when he was told there was, he took some salad instead. And this was very unusual in 1970. You really didn't meet vegetarians. Maybe if you were with an Indian, it might be a Hindu or a vegetarian for that reason, but you didn't really meet, people from your basic set of ideas who were vegetarians. And so I asked Richard Keshen, as this student was, why, and he said, well, he didn't think it was right to treat animals the way the animal whose meat I was then eating had been treated, which is both, a bit confronting, but also I said, well, why not? Don't they all have good lives out in the fields? And, sure, we know they get killed, but is that such a bad deal? But he said, well, no, they're being brought inside. They're very crowded. They're just being produced for profit, and anything that increases the profit, lowers the cost, will be done to them without any real concern for the animals. And so that started me thinking about this issue. And I met a couple of others, friends of Richard's, who were also already vegetarians. So, the idea was there. It was, a very small circle of people, now referred to as the Oxford Group. And in fact, there's a book just been published by Oxford University Press about the Oxford Group and the beginning of the animal rights movement. I think I was there early on, and I decided to write a book about it because I thought, well, this is really important, and more people need to know about this. This is a big issue that nobody is talking about.
Did you, when you wrote it back in the 70s, did you think that we would be better or worse in the year 2021? I don't know if you had the foresight to kind of look 50 years in the future, but
I wasn't specifically looking 50 years in the future, but I was I was curious as to whether the book would have an impact or not. There's two ways to look at it. One is, well, we're doing something terribly wrong. It's pretty obvious that it's wrong if you think about animals and if you care about animals at all. And after all, excuse me, after all, people do care about animals. They love their dogs and cats. So why shouldn't they care about the chickens and pigs and cows? This is going to really explode. And, once people realize what's going on, they'll stop eating meat and things will be very different. That's the kind of optimistic take on it that really relies on the idea that if you put out good reasons and explain things to people, they'll change their behavior. The more pessimistic view was, this is a gigantic industry, $1 trillion industry producing animal products. What hope have you got writing a book about that when, they will use all of their resources to try to convince people that what they're selling is fine and people should keep eating it? So I wasn't sure which of those scenarios would actually work out. And, unfortunately, perhaps it's more like the second. It's not that we haven't made some progress. It's not that the book hasn't had some impact. But, in terms of the meat industry, obviously, it's not only survived, but it's grown, especially when you consider that it's expanded to countries in Asia, which used to eat very little meat and are now eating more meat. So, yeah, in one sense, I'd hoped for something better than we have now. In another sense, I feared something worse, that the book would kind of sink without a trace because it was just too way out and too opposed to these huge industries.
yeah, it's fun. I mean, not funny is not the right word, but on the one hand, because there are more people now than there were 50 years ago, and because a lot of third world countries are, transitioning to living like the US lives and how Europe lives, there are more people eating meat. But there, within the percentage of, Western countries, there, like, the amount of vegans has never been higher, right? The amount of vegans or vegetarians in the US, in Europe, in Israel, and maybe not India as much as it used to be, but those things are growing. So there is definitely a trend of people eating less meat, even though overall there's still a huge consumption of meat.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's been a big increase in the number of vegetarians and vegans, and there's also much greater availability of plant-based foods. They're
Hmm.
there in the supermarkets. They're labeled. People can get them, and even people who are not vegetarian or vegan, who eat meat, um, they may still be eating plant-based foods a couple of times a week, and that has an impact as well, an impact on reducing the amount of meat produced. Because if you get 100 million people who halve their meat consumption, that's clearly as good as 50 million people eliminating their meat consumption. And
Yeah.
it's important to encourage people to reduce as well as to encourage people to stop altogether if they're up to that.
So, what are your thoughts about lab grown meat? Because I feel like there's two parties. I've heard the hardcore vegans argue that it somehow diminishes the movement, that we don't actually need meat, and by producing this, it kind of says that we do need meat. And then the other group saying, this will eliminate animal suffering, reduce carbon emissions, and it's still a way for people to get meat without actual slaughter of animals or the suffering of animals. Where do you stand on that?
Well, it's certainly true that we don't need meat, but that's not the point. The point is, people seem to like meat, or they're in the habit of eating meat, and they're continuing to do it. And the moral arguments that I've been putting up and that others in the animal movement have been putting up have not succeeded in dramatically reducing the amount of meat eaten. As we've been saying, they've reduced it to some extent, particularly in Western nations, but they've certainly, even in the nations where veganism is biggest, they've certainly not become a majority of the population. So, we need to do something about this. We need to do something about it urgently, both for the sake of the literally, tens of billions of factory farmed animals who are suffering right now, and for the sake of the planet and climate change. And even also now we're aware for the sake of reducing the risks of pandemics, because it's clear that factory farms are a source of new viruses, new zoonotic viruses. So this is an urgent issue, and if we can't wait another 50 years to hope that the ethical arguments lead more people to abandon meat. We've got to try what we can to get people to stop eating meat from factory farms, from sentient beings who are suffering, from beings who are producing greenhouse gases as they live. And lab meat or cultivated meat or cellular meat, whatever you want to call it, will do all of those things. No animal will suffer. Um, the quantity of greenhouse gas produced will be a very small fraction of what it is if you use real animals, and the risks of viruses developing and spreading will be reduced pretty much to zero. So I think it's an important step in our evolution of our diet to a more humane and less damaging to the planet kind of diet.
Why do you think the injustice to animals is kind of far down on most people's lists? Oftentimes when, you know, casually sitting with friends and having a delightful conversation and I bring up animal suffering, usually the response is going to be, well, at least that's what I hear. First, let's end, human suffering, right? Or child hunger or any of the human issues that we have, and then we can take care of animal ones. But then when I ask them, well, are you taking care of any of those things? Are you helping people? And they'll kind of laugh or they'll be a little embarrassed because they obviously don't. But I don't know why there's always this instinctual pushback when it comes to the topic of animal suffering. I don't know if it's because animals are maybe not as important in the minds of people, or is it because no, this is the food that I love, and you're attacking that.
Yeah, it's probably a bit of both, but I certainly think that animals still are less important, and that's really the result of speciesism, the idea that we just think that our species is somehow the most important, and everything else is secondary, and that really is quite parallel to racist attitudes, and exactly as those friends said to you, well, let's take care of the human problems first. you can, well, you don't have to go very far. You can look at literature from colonialist times, or when people were saying, well, what about, some people were trying to say, well, what about what we're doing to the Indians or Africans or whoever it might be? And other people would say, look, aren't you an Englishman? You should be taking care of your fellow English people, and it's very good for England to have this relationship, and we're prospering. Um, so it's a similar sort of thing going on. You have this attitude of bias towards the group that you're part of, and the group that you're part of, in the case of your friends, is humans rather than non-human animals. Just as in previous eras, it's been, English people or Americans or white people or fellow Christians or whatever else it might be.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree that humans are more important, but so I have two dogs. I love them to death, right? Like it's like kids. And if if you were to do an experiment where I had to save my dog versus a complete stranger, an adult, not a baby, not a kid, but an adult, I don't know what I would do if I had to save my dog, who I love, who's a family member to me, and I've had many experiences with my dog. He's what, 14 now, versus a complete stranger that I don't know. I don't know which one I would choose, to be honest.
Yeah, and I don't think you're the only person in that situation, actually. But this is really not exactly what I'm getting at, because yes, our dogs and sometimes our cats, maybe a horse if you live with a horse and have a horse close, uh, they are special, and people make exceptions for that. And so, you know most Americans are shocked by the idea of eating dogs, and they'll readily sign a petition to boycott countries, that are where dogs are eaten. Um, but that's not an issue of justice for animals or of ethical concern for animals. That's an issue of, um, these are animals I love because I know them, or I know, ones of their type, and they're part of the family. Uh, and again, we would not accept that in terms of racist attitudes. We would not accept people who said, yeah, well, I don't really care about blacks, but of course, the household slave that we have, she's a lovely woman, and yeah, in a fire, I would rescue her rather than some stranger who's white. That's not good enough, and it's not good enough in the case of animals either. Um, so I think we need to get beyond that, and we need to say it's not a matter of which beings do I love. It's a matter of which beings can suffer. What are we doing to them? How much are we making them suffer? Why are we doing that? And I think if we look at that, we will see that, again, to go back to the tens of billions of animals right now crowded into factory farms, that's a horrendous thing to do on a vast scale. It's causing an immense amount of suffering. And it's not necessary for us to survive, live good lives. In fact, it's harmful. It reduces our prospects of living sustainably on this planet and living good, healthy lives. So, that's really what we should be trying to get across to people. It's not so much who you love; it's a matter of thinking about the amount of suffering we're inflicting, and recognizing that that's wrong.
Yeah. And before I do want to I want to talk a little bit about suffering, but just to go back to my dog for a second, you know, he has a personality, he has moods, wants, desires, right? Likes and dislikes. He's an individual in a way, and there's only one of him, which makes him unique. And I think most owners would agree with that sentiment. But if I were to say that about a pig or a cow, I would get laughed at or dismissed at the very least. And I don't know why for me, it's very logical that if my dog would have all these traits and emotional capacity, that a pig, who's, I mean, I guess even smarter, would have that as well. Is it the fact that, again, like people just don't want to think about that? Or is it most people don't really have interactions with pigs, right? As much as we do with dogs. Most people don't interact with cows, pigs, chickens, etc. So it's easily to dismiss. They're far away in some farm. They're not, sleeping on my bed like the dog would.
Exactly. They don't have the interactions, and so they don't know. In fact, they're ignorant, perhaps, or they just don't think about it. But you're quite right. The pigs and the cows and the chickens too. When people do get to know them as individuals, they realize that they are unique, that they have individual personalities, and you can relate to them if you know them as individuals. So I think this is just we make them into commodities, and obviously they are commodities. So that's why they're there by the tens of thousands, packed into sheds and then hauled out and slaughtered and packed up into wrapped in plastic and sold in supermarkets. And if you're part of that, and if you're buying it regularly, it's very hard for you to think of it as individual. Think of them as individual beings, each of whom had a life to live, and each of whom suffered by being brought up in conditions that are not really suitable for their instinctive nature.
Yeah. So we're omnivores. We can survive, being carnivore, herbivore. We can go either way. Dogs and cats, they're carnivores. Is it more ethically justifiable for us to buy them meat because that's, they need it? It's not like us. And again, I don't know what it's a. I think in the U.S. it's something like a $10 billion industry. It's a massive industry, the pet industry, and they do consume a lot of meat. So what's your? Because I do know there's actually a couple of companies now that are creating um, herb like food for dogs that doesn't contain meat, but it has the exact same amount of nutrients. It has the same amount of protein, et cetera, minus the meat though.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's good because you're right. It is a big industry providing meat for dogs and cats, and the consequences for the animals are, it contributes to the commercial production of animals. It's part of the profitability of that industry that they can sell certain parts of their products to pet owners. So, where we can, I think we ought to avoid it. And if, with dogs, it's not that difficult actually, and it doesn't require, brand new products. I remember when I started writing animal liberation and thinking about this, talking to somebody from Ireland who said, Irish peasants never gave their dogs meat. They were too poor. They fed them on milk and potatoes. Sorry, well, I guess they're not vegan because they were giving them milk too. But dogs can do okay on a vegetarian diet. But if there's
But cats,
cats are much more difficult. Cats need taurine, which is an amino acid that you don't find in plant foods. There were some people trying to make foods for cats. Many years ago, we had a family cat, a stray that we adopted, and I tried some of these supplements. I must admit the cat didn't go for them really. So, we did end up feeding the cat, usually fish rather than meat, but still that's not good either. So, yeah, I mean, when you've got these animals, I think you have to feed them something that they will eat and that's good for them. If you can get nutritious alternative plant-based foods, that's great. Um, Maybe eventually lab meat will get down to the price where you can feed it to your cats and dogs, but that's some way off yet. So I think we're stuck. We're stuck with, particularly with the cats, with feeding them some animal products, and that's unfortunate. Something to think about if you decide to. If you're going to have a cat, maybe you need to think about a different kind of companion animal who doesn't have to eat animal products.
I mean, if you just let them loose, honestly, they're great hunters. My friends have cats. They'll bring back bats, rats. They hunt anything and everything.
They do, and that's obviously not a good thing either. It's not a good thing for our wildlife. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that's another reason not to have cats. Because you really face this choice: are you going to keep the cat indoors, which may not be a great life for the cat, or are you going to let the cat go outside, and then the cat is almost certain to be responsible for killing a lot of small birds and mammals and maybe reptiles. Um, and people
But
say,
isn't
"Oh
that
no,
part of
my cat, my Mogs would never do that," But in fact, there's lots of studies that show that they do. Studies where people have put little video cams on around the cat's neck, and sure, they go out and kill, and you don't even know about all of it. I mean, some cats will bring the stuff back and leave it on your doorstep, but other cats don't. They they still kill and then they just leave it there.
Yeah, but I mean, where I live, we have a lot of different animals here, but I see hawks, killing chipmunks. I'll see foxes come by my window with a squirrel in their mouth. So the wildlife, it eats other wildlife. That's just that's nature. But are you saying that cats, because we've kind of domesticated them, they don't belong in that frame, or what?
Yeah, basically I am. And it may depend where you are, but here I am in Australia. There were never cats in Australia before Europeans introduced them.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the situation is like in the United States or in other countries, but certainly in many of them it would be very similar. And the number of cats would be vastly greater than it would be in nature anyway. Uh, so it's yeah, I think that you can't say, well, this is part of the ecosystem that I live in. Um, Basically, it's not.
Yeah. Well, I guess yeah, I don't know. I live in New England, and there's a lot of wildlife here. I know that I remember seeing a documentary about Australia a few years back where you guys have a massive toad issue that was brought over from, I think it was like South America, and then they just exploded to the point where people just didn't know what to do with them. They would be driving on highways, right, and just hitting toads all along the way. That's what the
Well, this is a
documentary
small part
showed.
of Australia. This is up in the north. We don't have any cane toads. You're talking about cane toads. They were introduced
Yeah.
in order to get rid of snakes, I think it was, in the sugar cane. But yeah, so there's some parts of Australia where, sure, you know, you introduce something and then you it creates a problem. You do it for that you think it'll serve some good purpose, and in fact, then it just creates a problem. And we do have in parts of Australia, yes, cane toads are a serious problem, but we have everything else that we've introduced as well. As I say, I mean, we have a lot of feral cats in parts of Australia where there are no people now, but the cats were introduced by Europeans and have bred, and they're hunting native animals. We have feral pigs, we have feral donkeys, we have feral camels that were released because they were used for transport in parts of Australia before the railway went through, and they were released. They're breeding. We have a lot of feral horses. Yeah, this is a real problem in the sense of a conflict between concern for animals and concern for the environment and protecting Australia's unique native animals.
How do you feel? Because I feel like there's certain animals where I don't know if it's the cuteness factor, but there is concern with them. So we obviously have ownership over animals. We use them essentially for whatever we desire, from food to clothes to entertainment and medicine. And from time to time, we kind of arbitrarily decide to save some animals and give them some rights and some protections. And maybe because we realize how dire the situation is, usually they're just on the verge of extinction. Usually, it's the ones that maybe we don't directly need, and protecting them doesn't really inconvenience us much. Polar bears, orcas, sharks, elephants, lions, moon bears—they're all suffering directly or indirectly from us. But a lot of these animals and some others, they have massive campaigns behind them to save them. So I wonder why we kind of pick and choose why we want to save these animals, but we're not really concerned about all the other ones.
Yeah, some of them obviously it's because they're cute and they appeal to us. The panda bear is a classic example of that. Um, so we put a lot of effort into that. And some of them are, majestic. The elephants, the rhinos, and we don't want to lose them. But certainly, it's true there are less charismatic species that we're not so concerned about saving. So,
Pangolin.
sorry.
Like the pangolin, we seem to not care about the pangolin much.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think people in the Western world were aware of the fact that in China, pangolin are a delicacy and are being captured and eaten until we learned that they could well have been the cause of how the novel coronavirus got from animals to humans. and then suddenly people start becoming concerned about it. So that's not really an example of care for animals. That's an example of worries about ourselves and about pandemics.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about uh, China, I guess, for this example. But the majority of the pandemics that are happening, like you said earlier, are zoonotic. You know, MERS, Corona, SARS, Ebola, avian influenza, et cetera, et cetera. Many of those come from China, from places like the infamous wet markets. And every time, I feel like a lot of times when I try to speak or other people try to speak about it, the term cultural sensitivity comes up and it's used very heavily. We must respect other cultures, even though we don't agree with them. And I do agree with that to some extent. But when there are things that are happening, like these pandemics that kill people, cripple economies, essentially stop the whole world, I mean, the world has to kind of step in and say, like, okay, this is not okay. We should do something about this.
Yeah,
Do you agree with
absolutely.
that?
But we should be aware of what we're doing that's bad as well. It's not really just a matter of China. Okay, maybe the consumption of pangolins or bats and things like that that were related to the current pandemic did come out of China, but the previous pandemic, the swine flu pandemic of 2009, which also killed a lot of people, just didn't get as much attention because most of those people were in low-income developing countries. Uh, that came out of pig farms in the United States. So, in a way, the United States is in no position, and no country that has intensive pig farms is in any position to just point to China and say, hey, you're the ones who are causing the risk of more pandemics. Every country with intensive farms is increasing the risk of more pandemics, and we all ought to be taking action, not only against the wet markets and against culturally distinct practices like eating bats and pangolins, but thinking about everything that is likely to create new zoonotic viruses or spread zoonotic viruses to humans for which we have no resistance.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot do come from China, though. I think they eat something like 50% of the world's pork is eaten in and consumed in China. So it's a massive market. I mean, it's a lot of people, obviously. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It just seems like a lot of the pandemics do come from there. And I don't know if it's because they eat, animals that maybe the rest of the world doesn't, or maybe it's not as clean. Whatever the reasons, it just seems like a huge chunk does come from China.
Well, China is a significant part of the world's population, of course. It is a very large population area. Yeah, and some it do, but as I say, swine flu didn't. Some of the avian bird flu didn't come from China. Some of it, I think, came from Thailand, other countries in Asia. And it's quite likely that it could come from US or
Yeah.
Australian or Israeli or anywhere where there's factory farms. Ebola came out of Africa, it seems. So I don't think it's particularly China. I think it's a global issue.
Okay. I've heard you state that the three biggest ethical catastrophes we're facing are climate change, extreme poverty, and the way we treat animals. Could you maybe expand on that and just what's the argument for why those are the most important?
Well, those three are all big things that are happening to a very large number of sentient beings, and uh, they're all things that need really a global approach if we're to overcome those problems. Climate change is the one that's most obviously needs a global approach because the greenhouse gases that any particular country puts in the atmosphere don't only harm people in that country, they harm people all over the world. So, unless we can control greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, we are going to make everybody worse off, humans and animals, and not just now, but for a very long time in the future. Because once things go wrong with the climate and various climatic patterns change, it's going to be extremely difficult if to reverse those patterns if we ever can. Once you've got the polar ice melted, it's gone. Once you've got the methane frozen in the permafrost of Siberia released, it's in the atmosphere. It's going to be very difficult to get out of the atmosphere again. If things like the Gulf Stream cease to operate, how are you going to restart something like that? And that'll have catastrophic consequences, particularly for Northern Europe. So that's a huge problem that needs a global solution. Extreme poverty is something that I think it's really a scandal that in a world that has so much affluence, so many people living at a standard of living that nobody lived at before, like 100 years ago. How is it that we still have close to 1 billion people in extreme poverty? It has been dropping. We have been making progress on that in the last year because of the pandemic and the economic recession that triggered. The number of people in extreme poverty has gone up again for the first time in about 20 years. That's bad news. But I hope that once the pandemic is over and the lockdowns are over, we'll continue to make the progress we were before. But still, that's a big problem. We're talking about maybe 800 billion people whose lives are below a level at which we really think humans ought to be able to live, below one that's compatible with human dignity and with human flourishing. And yet, as I say, we have all of this poverty. So this is not an insoluble problem at all. It's just a problem where we need the will of people in affluence to make efforts and commitments to help to bring the whole world up to at least a minimally decent standard of living. And then animals we've been talking about, a lot of people don't realize how huge this is. We have something like 7.8 billion human beings living on the planet, but we have maybe 10 times that many animals in being reared and killed for food every year, and that's only land-based vertebrates. So, maybe 70 billion land-based vertebrate animals raised and killed for food each year. If you include fish, we're probably getting up to 1 trillion. And fish are sentient beings. They're vertebrates too. I'm sure they suffer when they're caught and hauled out of the water, and they suffocate or they die from decompression. There's basically no humane slaughter for fish. So it's a vast amount of suffering. Yuval Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, has said that perhaps this is the greatest crime humanity has committed is what we do to non-human animals. I think he's focused particularly on factory farming in saying that. But that's an interesting judgment from somebody who's studied the entire history of the human species and comes up with this conclusion that it's and somebody with an Israeli background, so he's not oblivious about the Holocaust and the various other crimes that have been committed at all, but he still thinks that maybe what we're doing to animals is even worse. That's a pretty strong judgment. So as that, and also, as we've been saying, it reinforces greenhouse gas emissions, so it increases climate change, it increases risks of pandemics, it's not necessary for our health. So that's another vast issue, and that's why I pick up these three major issues as things that we need to tackle and that we need to tackle at a global level.
For extreme poverty, is it incumbent upon governments or what are some ways, because you kind of touched upon that on that point, what are some ways that if individuals can help, what are some ways that they can? And if not, is it, like I said, just incumbent on governments to somehow find solutions for the close to 1 billion people who are in extreme poverty?
So it would be great if governments would do this. So far, they've not been doing nearly enough. Many governments have very low levels of foreign aid, although back in the 1970s, the United Nations called on every country to give 0.7% of its gross national product to foreign aid. In other words, 70 cents in every $100 the nation earns, which doesn't really seem like a lot, but only a handful of nations have done that. The United States is very far from doing that. They're around 20, in the low 20 cents, so like less than a quarter, less than 25 cents for every $100 the nation earns. And Australia is not doing much better than that either. So, if governments are not doing what they should be doing, then it's up to the rest of us to step up, and we can. There's nothing stopping us. There are some very effective organizations, maybe more effective than government aid departments generally are, that are working to help people in extreme poverty. You can easily locate them. You go to thelifeyoucansave.org and you'll find a list of about 20 recommended non-profit organizations working specifically to help people in extreme poverty. They've all been independently studied and assessed as being highly effective, so you can be confident that your funds will do good, that what you donate will actually be doing a lot of good there. And it's up to us, I think. I think we should be doing a lot more, and that's what I've argued in my book, The Life You Can Save, which, by the way, you can download absolutely free as either an ebook or an audiobook from the website, The Life You Can Save. And I think, everybody who's middle class or above, who's reasonably comfortably off, should be doing something significant to help people in extreme poverty.
Yeah. Is that enough? I know the U.S. is the most charitable country per individuals. I don't know what the number, but it
That's
gives to
not true,
charity.
actually. That's a U.S. myth. I'm sorry, that just isn't true.
I've seen like those stats. The U.S. gives not the government, individuals give to charity more than any other country.
Not true. I think Ireland actually
Really?
is higher. No, and actually, well, this is not a great example at the moment, but somewhat surprisingly, Burma was higher on an individual basis. Part of the Buddhist ethic.
No, but as a total of what the U.S.
Oh, do you mean in dollars rather than in percentage of income? Oh, well, in dollars,
correct.
yes. Yeah, okay.
Correct. That's what I meant.
But that doesn't mean that individuals are more generous than other people. It just means that it's a bigger country with a larger population.
No, I'm not trying to say that the U.S. is more charitable than. I'm just saying I've seen stats that say that the U.S. gives a lot compared to other countries, and again, because there's a very affluent population here. Whatever the reasons, I'm not saying.
But the other thing is, it doesn't give to other countries, even individuals. Only 6% of individual donations go overseas.
Okay.
Or abroad, I should say. Most of that charity, the largest recipient of U.S. charity is religious institutions. People are giving to their church or synagogue or mosque.
Unfortunate. That is unfortunate.
And the second largest is educational institutions, and those institutions that are already
like
very
Ivy
wealthy.
League school.
Yeah, like where I teach at Princeton or Harvard or Yale or Stanford, or they're the biggest recipients of charitable dollars going to education. It's not really going to help people in extreme poverty.
There's a lot of people trying to do good things in the world, a lot of companies as well. Many probably not, but there's an example is Tom's Shoes, which is a company where every pair you buy, they donate a pair to countries in Africa, countries in need, people that don't have shoes. And what happened, unfortunately, is that a lot of countries where they donated to, it kind of undercut the local industry. So people really can't compete with free. And when they get something free, it undercuts the industries. And it's good for the people that are getting it because they maybe couldn't afford, but industries lose because of that. My question is, I guess, is there a good way to allocate that money that these nonprofits have? Like, what is the best way in order for both the people that need it and both industries kind of to make them grow?
Yeah, well, that's exactly an example of why you need to really make sure that what you're doing is effective, and why we have organizations like The Life You Can Save and like GiveWell that are doing just that, that are doing the research to see that you're helping without harming, and sending fully manufactured shoes over to countries where there are already shoe industries obviously does have this big downside that you're likely to put that industry out of business and put more people into poverty who used to work there. So good intentions are not enough. You really need to know what you're doing. And so this is an area where you should look at the experts. You should go online to these websites and instead of thinking, yeah, well, okay, I'll buy these shoes because they're going to do some good, look at the organizations that really are doing good, that are effectively protecting people against malaria, restoring sight in people who are blind, but merely because they have cataracts, which can easily be removed with an inexpensive operation, providing mentorship for people who want to start small businesses and assisting them in getting going to pull themselves out of poverty, even just giving cash directly to people. Sorry, now I've got a phone, but I'll ignore it. Even just, maybe I better wait for it to start ringing.
I can just probably press aside, it just mutes it. Yeah.
It'll stop. Even just giving cash to people in extreme poverty, which an organization called Give Directly does, is much better, because then they use that cash to benefit themselves in the ways that they judge to be best, and they provide employment because there's more cash in the economy and they're buying things, and there are other people who are benefiting from that as well. So there are a lot of good ways of helping people in extreme poverty, but they do require some thought. And just the fact that a shoe company thinks that this is going to be a great promotion doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to help people.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Let's talk a little bit about something that you mentioned earlier, which is suffering. When we discuss suffering, can two things maybe coexist simultaneously? So suffering is obviously objectively bad for animals and for that we enslave, torture, kill, etc. It's also bad for the world's poorest that suffer from lack of water or anything else. Physical abuse, people that go through that, it's horrific. All those things are objectively horrific. But also, I wonder if the opposite of suffering, avoid of suffering, is bad as well, specifically in the West, where life is, relatively good. It's relatively convenient, at least compared to third world countries where people go through horrific things. Do we need to suffer a little bit? Or maybe not even suffer, but do we need to experience hardships for personal growth, for, thicker skin, to challenge ourselves? You have people that do these amazing, insane races, the Moab race and all these other ones, and they become better people. And there's a lot of people that follow them and they want to do those. They want to challenge themselves. They want to, for lack of a better word, suffer. So can those two coexist?
Look, if people want to choose to do things that are going to make them suffer, then that's their choice. I'm not going to tell them they can't do that.
But there's growth through that suffering. I guess that's what I mean.
Okay, so there may be for some people, and as you say, especially if you choose this suffering and it's not something you have to endure, that's forced upon you by the circumstances you were born in. I don't know that that's going to cause that much growth. Particularly, if the result of the poverty is that you don't get a decent education, or you're ill with malaria frequently. So I don't think suffering always causes growth. It may sometimes, but I think most people don't want it in their lives and will have more growth without it. And if that's the case, and there are ways that we can help to reduce their suffering, then I think that's a good thing to do.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I just think a lot of times there's ideas that maybe we think, or things that contradict themselves, but they actually can live harmoniously together. Like two things can coexist at the same time. And I think that's just kind of them. Suffering can be really bad, and it really can actually help you grow to become a better person, to maybe reach your full potential, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, possibly.
Is there a better way maybe to categorize suffering? Like what is suffering? Is it a lack of happiness? Is a teenager going through a breakup? He feels like his world's going to die. There's people that have committed suicide because of that, but that's not equivalent to a starving person in a third world country. Like,
no, it's not.
How do you quantify that?
Well, it's very hard to quantify either pains or pleasure at the moment. We have various survey instruments, but they're not completely reliable at quantifying. So that's a difficult thing to do. But The teenager is certainly suffering, but we can predict that the teenager is going to get out of that, and it will pass, and the teenager will still have a good life. We can't predict that with somebody who's living in extreme poverty and doesn't see a path out of that in the circumstances that they're in.
Okay. And I guess final question from me. What is your position? I mean, I guess I kind of know, but I would like you to expand about oysters, mussels, clams, scallops. Are they okay to eat, knowing that they're not sentient, don't have a nervous system, and as far as we know, they don't experience pain?
I think that's correct. I think these simple bivalves don't have the nervous system to experience pain. I don't think they're conscious beings. And as long as they're grown and harvested, or if they are grown in a sustainable way, which they can be because they actually have a water filtering effect on the area of water that they're in. They clean it up. So then I think that they are fine to eat. They're sustainable. There's no suffering.
Okay. All right. Before we go, I'd love to talk a little bit about your new book, The Golden Ass. I didn't know about it. I had to do a little bit of research because I never heard about it before. But why did you decide to edit it? And maybe can you give us a little bit of a backstory on the book?
Sure, but first let me say what you said is just exactly why I wanted to edit and bring it out, because I think this is an amazing literary work, and it's a work from the 2nd century of the Christian era.
Wow.
So when you ask people what was the earliest novel, some people will say Gulliver's Travels, some people will say Don Quixote. Some people who know a bit about other cultures will say the Tale of Genji, which is I think a 10th century Japanese novel.
Mm-hmm.
This is 800 years earlier than the Tale of Genji.
Wow.
And it's very amusing. I'm not putting this out as a heavy literary work. It's really fun. It's a rollicking, bawdy kind of tale. It has erotic scenes in it. It has magic in it. It has, and this is why I originally got interested in it, a man who gets transformed into a donkey and then lives the life as a donkey and describes what it's like to be a donkey in Roman times and all the things that happened to a donkey in Roman times. So it's a remarkable example of empathy with an animal as well. But no, very few people have heard of it. Even fewer, obviously, have read it. And I think that was partly because it has a lot of digressions, as well as having this central, amusing, hilarious, sometimes, and informative narrative. It has a lot of side stories. And I thought, that might be why people aren't reading it. And if we cut that out, we get a relatively short novel, maybe 35,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
That's really fun to read. And a lot of people, I think, would like to read this. People concerned about animals, people interested in Roman times and what life was like in Roman times. But also just people who like a good story, because it's kind of an adventure story of what happens to this man when he gets turned into a donkey and all the adventures he has. And, it's like a bit of a cliffhanger in places. He's about to be killed and then something else happens. So
don't give too much away. Don't give too much away.
No, okay. I won't give no spoilers. But so I found scholar of the author is called Apuleius. I found a scholar of Apuleius who was prepared to do a new, fresh, lively translation. Professor Ellen Finkelpearl from California, and we got a couple of illustrators, a couple of Russian sisters whose illustrations I'd seen to illustrate it as well. And now Norton will bring it out. It'll be published on April 20th in the United States and a couple of weeks later in the UK and Australia. And I hope a lot of people will pick it up and read it, just for fun. It's a good read, and I'm sure there are other things you can pick up as well. I've written about it. Professor Finkelpearl has written a little bit about it at the back too. But read it for the enjoyment of the story, and other things will come as you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I already have it queued on Amazon. I'm just waiting for it to be released. I'll definitely be buying it. Was this your first time doing this type of project? Because usually, obviously, you write it, but is this the first time?
Yeah, that's correct. It is. I've edited other books like collections of essays and anthologies for teaching bioethics, but this was the first time that I'd taken an existing literary work and tried to present it in a way that makes it more readable, more entertaining, and brings out what's basically the core of the story in a way that I think could really attract a large readership. I hope a lot of people will get it and give it to others as presents, because it's going to be an attractively packaged little book with the illustrations. So, yeah.
Yeah, guys, go check
glad
it
you've
out.
ordered it.
I'm waiting. I can't wait. Well, once I started to read about it, I was like, okay, this is interesting. And Peter's, I'm definitely buying it. So yeah, it's no brainer for me. But guys, go make sure you check it out and buy it as well, because it looks awesome.
Terrific.
All right.
Okay. Peter, thanks very much, Roy. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. This was an honor for me. I really enjoyed it. Where can people find you? What are the other maybe places people can pick up your books, and just any plugs that you have?
Okay, sure. Well, I've already mentioned, the book, The Life You Can Save. You can get absolutely free as an ebook on at the website, thelifeyoucansave.org, or you can get an audio book, which is where every chapter is read by a celebrity who donated their time. Kristen Bell, for example, has read a chapter. Paul Simon of the singer-songwriter has read a chapter. Mike Schur from The Good Place. A lot of people have kindly donated their time to read it, so you can get the audiobook if you prefer the audiobook. The other place to find out about me is my website, petersinger.info. That's a good place to find out what else I'm writing, whether there's some new events you can go to, and a lot of other general information about me.
All right. Peter Singer, thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate it.
Good. Great. Terrific. Okay. Thanks. Good to talk to you. Glad we got it done. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.